Okay, thank you Data Team Summit for having us today. My name is Shane Murray. I'm the field CTO at Monte Carlo, the data observability platform. Today I'm joined by Eric Callahan and Brandon Beidel to discuss data engineering trends and predictions for 2023. We're going to cover some topics like the trends and predictions for 23, building and scaling data platforms and operationalizing them in your organization, and then implementing data quality and reliability initiatives across the organization. So welcome, Eric and Brandon. Maybe we could start by introducing yourselves and telling us about your respective careers in data. And Eric, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I'm Eric. I came into really sort of the data focus from the analytics side. I spent the first decade or so of my career solely in the analytics space, kind of doing it all within that analytics space. And only in the last 5 years or so have I ventured a little bit more into the data engineering side, mostly in startups. And it's been great, really, to kind of get under the hood because 15 years ago, in the analytics space, you kind of you just expected that you'd get a nice clean table of data and everything would be great. It never occurred to you that you could be doing analytics and maybe it would be wrong because the underlying data was wrong. So that's sort of how I got here. Yeah.
And Brandon, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Brandon. I work at a firm called Red Ventures as a marketing agency. And my career to get to this point is a little bit of a meandering journey between software engineering, data analyst, data scientist, data engineer, really taking a scenario of tackling the problem at hand. Working as a data scientist, data quality was a problem that required data engineering skills. So we chased those problems down. So my career has really been a progression of what is the biggest problem we're facing right now? Well, let's go learn those skills to address that problem.
Great. And definitely see mobility as a key for data teams these days, having people learn the skills across disciplines. So maybe let's start with 2023 trends and predictions, the kind of reason we're here. And I'll start with you, Eric. What are some of your predictions for data teams in 2023?
Well, I mean, I think we're seeing budgets across the board. A lot of companies are kind of trying to reduce budgets and they're doing that with headcounts. So I think what we'll probably see is eventually, later on in the year, right, we'll probably see a shift towards investment in tools. As people, I honestly, at first, it'll probably be companies asking people to do more, to do the same or more with less, and saying all right, we've reduced headcount. Can you just keep doing the same thing, please? And at some point, I think probably a couple months in, they'll say you're going to need to invest a little bit in some tools to help us. I think a lot of kind of the modern data stack has lots of different components that are maybe they were legacy, and maybe you've got some parts that are really optimized for the modern stack and some that are not. So I think as we try to reconcile and say, all right, how do we do this right now, especially with less resource, I think you're going to have to see the focus shifting to, all right, are there tools that can kind of help orchestrate these things or have them talk together or communicate? And I think it'll be almost a forcing function, right, where data teams are going to have to say, we're going to need to invest in these tools and these things that really bring our stack into a completely modern space if you want us to be able to produce with less headcount and less people doing some of these manual maybe tasks that used to be in a legacy environment not able to be done with tools.
Brandon, any thoughts to add there?
Yeah, I think I echo the sentiment of the do more with less is going to be a key theme this year. I think layered on top of that is for data teams is bringing in some self-awareness of the true cost of how you're operating. What does it cost to run your data stack? That is going to be a question your leaders are going to ask of you. And we need to know those numbers in order to really truly make thoughtful decisions about what technologies to invest in and where to be spending our time and effort. So financial literacy, financial awareness, whatever you want to call it, but we're part of the P&L, we need to be aware of it.
And so, I mean, both of you have kind of raised the idea of sort of economic uncertainty playing on the data leader's mind, and some belt tightening happening across, pretty much every industry. Are you seeing kind of technologies or trends that actually point to where teams might be able to reduce costs, shift to more automation, or shift their kind of resource mix in approaching data problems? Brandon.
Yeah, I think we're starting from a point where we want to answer some very basic questions about our data as it is today, and then kind of build into the more advanced thoughts. So like 3 questions that we're specifically asking our teams to ask are: is the data useful that we're creating? Are people using it? Can they access it? Because if they're producing assets that aren't being used, well, then let's not produce those assets. Is the system reliable? Because there's a trade-off between reliability and cost. The frequency at which you're updating data is incurring costs, and therefore maybe we don't need it every 15 minutes. We can do it every hour and kind of make those trade-offs. And then back to that kind of expensive operation, thinking about it in terms that the business is going to understand. So we actually are pushing our teams to think about it in terms of the denominator being unit cost per conversion or unit cost per sale in terms of our data operations. So that way, when we're going into these leadership conversations, we can say, this is our per unit cost of operations for our technology. So that way we can really be weighed against the marketing expense and the people ops expense and legal expense. And so we can really have an apples to apples comparison. Because I think the thing I try to avoid having the conversation is someone just calls something expensive without bringing a number. And right. As a data person, like I need to have some sort of measuring stick to really have a thoughtful conversation there.
I mean, that's super interesting. I see a lot of people kind of running from the idea that we should be measuring ROI on data platforms, but it really feels like you're embracing it as something that data leaders want to own and take charge of that conversation.
Yeah, if you're not owning it, you are just going to get hammered with it.
Yeah, exactly. Eric, what about from you? Any technologies or trends you see about reducing costs and resources?
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably echo what I said to your first question, which is that it's probably in my head, I would be thinking about anything related to orchestration or unification across the stack, because if you're told, all right, you've got to reduce expense, the first thing you're going to look for is like, what are inefficiencies, right? If there are any areas of your stack that are maybe not talking to each other, or they're stitched together manually, that's a place that you can maybe have an opportunity to say, let's get some sort of tool or something to automate this process and reduce some of the maybe unnecessary manual stuff.
Got it. And so, last year there was a lot of movement around things like data mesh. There's new approaches being charted in terms of things like metrics layers. We're seeing some merging of warehouse and lake technologies, and generally the rise of data engineering. Eric, are you expecting more of the same, or what do you see as kind of a breakout trend in 2023?
Honestly, one of the things that got me excited, like coming from the analytical background, is the sort of the ripping down of the wall between SQL and Python in a lot of environments. So specifically Snowpark, right? That was something that was launched last year by Snowflake, and that, to me, from an analytical standpoint, I've always thought of, you've got your analytical layer and maybe your SQL derived variables that live in your analytics layer. But then, when it's time to do more advanced things and make a feature store, a lot of times you've got to take that stuff out of your SQL environment and apply Python transformations, right? And then you've got your separate feature store. Now that we're sort of getting to this place where, you can actually create metrics using Python, and you've got, dbt talking to Snowpark and even some Databricks integrations as well. I think as you see that sort of wall break down between SQL and Python, you might be able to see the merging a little bit of maybe the analytics layer and KPIs and feature store, and maybe some of these machine learning features get piped back into your analytical layer, and they become KPIs that you can actually use in reporting and things like that. So to me, that's a big thing to keep an eye on this year.
Yeah, it feels like that's been a pretty artificial barrier between data science and data analytics that's existed for a while.
Yeah, just because of the technology limitations, So yeah. as we eliminate that, like, great.
Brandon, how about from you?
Yeah, I think Eric hinted at one of the two things I'm kind of expecting this year. And one is we've seen a lot of democratization from a lot of tools that we have, been introduced to in the modern data stack, tools that are essentially enabling more and more people to both produce and consume data. And I think this year I kind of expect a little bit of a pendulum swing to kind of respond to the second order impacts of having more users both creating and consuming data. So, as more people consume data and produce it, you're going to think about governance and security and privacy and inefficiencies in compute and spend, and like combine all those economic pressures to make sure are we using the tools we have today effectively, good governance, good privacy, good security, all of those components. I think there's going to be opportunities in those spaces, both in practices and in tooling. And then on the other side, I think the economic pressures and a lot of what I feel like I see in the space, the lines between tools, I think, are going to overlap more and more. Feature sets are going to start to look very similar when I'm looking at tool A versus tool B. And I think we're going to start to see some either consolidation or maybe some cloud providers are going to start, drawing in some of these tool sets into their offerings as native components. But just kind of a consolidation of vendor management, I think, is probably a longer term trend I'm expecting.
Yep. And so let's maybe shift onto a different topic and talk about the kind of data platform and how you scale a data platform strategy. So I'll start with you here, Brandon, but how should data leaders really be thinking about designing and building an enterprise data platform, and especially one that kind of scales to these needs to democratize data or democratize even the production of data products?
Yeah, I think for me, focusing on outcomes and making sure we don't get just pulled into a particular tool, and we really focus on the objective we're driving towards. Your end user doesn't care what orchestration tool you use; they care that your data shows up on time. So, just remind yourself of that on a regular basis. The tool is not the important part, the outcome is. The tools will help you drive to that outcome. But as you're making these decisions, you need to focus on the outcome. And then I think the other piece that I would recommend focusing on is thinking about constraints. In any system, there is a constraint. There is not, you're going to find a place where you are limited in what output you can produce. When you resolve that constraint, there will be a new place where you will have a constraint, and really addressing those as they come up. If you optimize some part that is not the constraint, you are not going to improve the throughput of the system.
Yes. Eric, how about you on that same question?
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with what Brandon said about focusing on the outcomes. And I think a little bit of the how about that is when you think about the data underneath, right? Any data products or any platform scaling is really going to be fundamentally based on the data model, right? And in order to get that right, I think you really need to make sure you understand your business. And that's that's the fundamental thing to me, right? Just making sure you really understand the business and how it operates and how it thinks about different properties within the business, right? Whether it be marketing or product or tech or whatever it is, what's important to the business and what are those outcomes that they're going to ask for, like Brandon said, right? And then based on that, just thinking about the way to construct the data model, because once you're sort of locked in, you want to make sure that you're in a right place where the stuff can sort of scale very well. So I think just making sure that you double down and just really 100% understand the business, because what is the data? At the end of the day, it's just a representation of the business, right? And what the business is actually doing.
And so coming back to Brandon, I mean, the thing you mentioned about constraints, one way a lot of people are tackling that is to really push towards this idea of a self-serve data platform and a data mesh kind of strategy. I'm interested to get your take on whether that's something you are pursuing or whether you think of self-service really through a data consumer angle. And yeah, how do you think about a data platform as self-serve?
Yeah, I think it's helpful for us to break down the kind of the life cycle of the data itself and what places we are democratizing and not. So we, for instance, have tools set up to allow analysts to handle data ingestion. They can bring in new data sources in kind of a meaningful way on their own. that has second order implications on, cleanliness and privacy and security and those sorts of things, which we have a centralized team addressing. Like I don't expect my analysts to know how to scrub PII out of the warehouse. We put in guardrails, but ultimately, like, there's a central team to kind of manage the really, really sensitive bits. We have elements for transformation. We bring in DBT to kind of democratize that, to allow people to build those logical components that they want to see represented. And then also activation. We have tools to allow them to send data to third parties, again, with bumpers on the lane. We don't want to just give everyone full access to everything and really put ourselves at risk, but we have a centralized teams kind of putting those constraints on those systems. And then when those constraints are in place, allowing those teams to go in far as fast as they want.
Yeah. And those constraints are essentially standards or policies, right? Yeah. And so, Eric, I'm interested, do you have a different perspective or similar perspective on centralization and decentralization of capabilities for the data team?
I think it actually is pretty related to maybe the maturity, the data maturity of your organization, and sort of what they're ready for and what they're ready to self-serve, right? If you have a very young data organization, right, where people aren't necessarily used to it, and maybe this is the first time you're trying to really stand something up, it's going to be harder to say, here's the data, go get it, right? You might have to be a little more centralized and a little more, prescriptive, and saying, like, here's exactly the report that you need. We're going to build it for you. Here's what it looks like. As you become a more mature data organization, right, where you have maybe people in different parts outside of the data team that are able to, they're analysts who are able to run SQL. So maybe you say, well, here's the data, you can consume it this way, or people who are more familiar with BI, and you can say, you know what, you can make a Tableau report, you can make a Looker dashboard, or whatever you want to do. So I think in some respects, it's going to be based on sort of what the stage of the organization is and what they're ready for.
Yeah. And you mentioned very clearly at the start, kind of economic pressures on teams. Interested how you think about building versus buying tools in your data stack, and has that shifted at all with the economic pressures?
I mean, I think at a macro level, yeah, it's probably going to end up being more of a shift generally towards buy than build, just because build involves headcount, which is generally more expensive. That being said, like on a micro level, if you're asking how do you sort of make that decision, right? I think that's more of a case by case basis, and figuring out what your specific needs are, right? If you know that you need A, B, and C, and you look out there and there's a tool that gives you A, B, and C, great. Like, why reinvent the wheel, right? And if there's a tool that gives you A and B but not C, then, like, all right, like, maybe you can buy it anyway if it's not super expensive, and you know that you can fill in the gaps of C with minimal effort, right? And then maybe there's a tool that just gives you A, and you're like, all right, well, now I need to make the determination of if having, paying someone who's going to do B and C, should I just let them do A anyway and not buy this tool? So I think it really sort of depends on what your needs are and where you are.
Brandon?
Yeah, I think I would echo a lot of that sentiment. It's the determining what success looks like, determining what you're solving for, and making sure that you're generating that list and not just going to a vendor marketing page and just saying, oh yeah, that sounds great, like let's buy all the things. Being very specific about what need you are trying to solve for, and then working backwards into that cost benefit analysis of does it give me all the things I need? If not, well, then I need to fill in those gaps in some combination of build and buy. I really think it is a both scenario. There are things that are not going to be strategic differentiators for you as a company, for any company. There are going to be things that are your secret sauce that you're going to want to do, and you're going to want to have like component in house. You don't want to outsource it and be subject to the contractual changes that you might experience through a vendor. So they are trade-offs everywhere.
Yeah, and I think that you both pointed towards this idea of what are your strategic differentiators, right? Is the tool a commodity that's going to be the same across every company, or is this something that you should be thinking about doing in-house? So taking a different angle on the idea of kind of a data platform, I'm interested how you think about a question I talk to a lot of leaders is centralization of the data org and the data team versus a kind of fully decentralized model, and anything in between, the kind of hub and spoke and center of excellence models that have become pretty popular. Where do you kind of sit on this spectrum, and maybe when would you choose to choose one over the other, or to decentralize? I'll start with Eric here.
Yeah, I think similar to my last answer, I think it's going to depend on the data maturity of your organization. I think that if you are a new to data organization, right, it probably is not going to serve you well to have people sitting in different teams when you're still trying to kind of maybe create a central foundation in the first place. So I think as you're sort of building something and getting it ready to go, building up your governance guardrails and your standardized definitions and your standardized processes and all things like that, probably makes sense to have it centralized. Once you're on solid footing, though, and you've had people who maybe have sat on that centralized team and they sort of know what they're doing, and you want to send them out to sit in product, at that point it can make sense, right? Because you're on the same page, you're speaking the same language. To sort of start that way before you have sort of a unified approach is probably going to lead to miscommunication and some issues.
I think I would agree with Eric. There's certainly not a one size fits all. Depends on where you are on the whole journey. I think the lens that Eric hinted at around kind of development of skill, I think, is a critical one. Even if you are in a distributed environment, I think making sure that there is an opportunity for people to have that technical mentorship, get those feedback loops, look at those, making sure that they are developing those skills and practices and protocols, regardless of the organization shape, I think is probably the thing that I try to focus on more and more all the time, because hiring good people and retaining them and then giving them and then just letting them tackle problems, I think, is the most rewarding part about working in larger organizations, is just like seeing how much other people can do.
Yeah, totally agree with that. And so I'm going to shift now our focus to thinking about, data reliability and observability in 2023. Both of you have a lot of experience in this area. Maybe starting with Brandon, how has the ownership and process around solving data reliability shifted in the organizations you've been in, and who really owns this problem the way you tackle it?
Yeah, so back to this theme of democratization, we have been really taking an effort to push data quality ownership out to the producers of data. Get it at its source, and also empowering the consumers to ask critical questions of their data in programmatic ways. If there is an expectation of my data must meet this standard in order for me to trust my report, great. Analyst, here's the tool so you can put in the tests and run these assertions and get the feedback when things look wonky. So that way you can remove the intermediate of, hey, I need to go ask this data engineer, like, hey, this number looks funny. Can you look at it? Like those are the interceding points during the day that really throw someone off what they're doing. But if you can we found that if you can give that kind of self-service, empowering, I feel good about it, I've answered the questions I need, I can trust everything end to end to that end consumer, they feel better about it. And then on the producer side, we're really trying to push catching stuff that meet what are the expectations of data before it enters the pipeline? How do we identify it and then push that back out to the external system, either by quarantining it, or not running our data pipeline, or throwing some alert, or some sort of prophylactic measure to prevent the ingestion of what we would perceive as malformed or bad data.
Yeah. Interested in, that's a huge shift in kind of the mindset of an organization around data ownership and even resolving problems with data. How far do you feel you're down that path as an organization?
I think we're plenty of room to improve. There's always more would improve, but I think we've seen a lot of great strides on the consumer side. I think we need a lot more to do on the pushing things back to the producer to really make sure that we are getting high quality inputs.
Got it. And Eric, maybe I'll go to you. How do you think about sort of building trust and quality into data products, and where observability fits into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's the key, right? What you said is trust. I think that as far as observability, data quality, these are all kind of table stakes, right? If you want to be trusted, if you want to be a trusted member of your organization, I think, you know, to kind of related to what Brandon was saying about pushing the onus of quality and all these things onto producers. I mean, it sounds great. I think. I think it's much easier said than done, as you said, Shane. As far as like how far down the road are you? In general, I think like probably no one is very far down that road, because at the end of the day, if there's some sort of data emergency and something happens, like the CEO is going to look at the data team, right? And that's where the ownership is going to go. So I think there's a lot of work to be done around shifting that ownership. But I think while we sort of have this conversation and debate about like where ownership should live, having an observability tool, a quality, you know, discoverability sort of thing is a great way to sort of have everyone say like, all right, well, we can all go to this place. Doesn't matter who necessarily owns it, but we can all sort of look here and see, and here's a thing that's kind of monitoring and informing us what's going on as we sort of figure out the little bits about ownership and things like that.
Yeah, yeah, and it you know, across customers I speak to, I see even the most advanced customers still saying they're building the operational muscle around this, even as they're progressing into new practices like establishing service levels across the organization. Brandon, a specific question for you. You know, your team at Red Ventures leverages Monte Carlo to drive data observability. Any sort of outcomes you can share from what you've been able to achieve there?
Yeah, I think, you know, Monte Carlo is a tool we use to really push the kind of self-service building trust on our consumers. So we give that to our marketing teams to ask critical questions about the performance of their marketing. So they can go in and build whatever custom monitors to say, hey, if I have some sort of spike in performance or drop in performance on a week-over-week basis, let me know so I can take some action on an external system. And so by allowing them to do that on their own, we've again kind of broken the cycle of they have to go in and ask an engineer, is this right? Like, what's wrong with my dashboard? Instead, they can say, oh, yes, here's the query I wrote. I trust this data. I know what the outcome is. And now I have some sort of crib sheet of here are the things I need to do when this occurs. So Monte Carlo has allowed us to give that power to these marketing analysts. So they basically build task lists, which are intended to be taken after an alert is fired.
Gotcha. And so we've got a couple of minutes left here. I think we'll go to sort of last words, and I'll start with Brandon here. You know, one trend that kind of emerged or re-emerged in 2022 across data is this idea of data contracts. Either you can pass this question, but I'm interested in you know, how you think about where that can be successful. Is it part of your strategy, or are you choosing to go in another direction?
Yeah, I think it's certainly, it's funny to see these sorts of things like pop up, you know, in software engineering, and then kind of like follow around the rest of commerce. This is where I go back to putting the onus back on producers. And so we ingest a lot of files and things from APIs in terms of our marketing data. So that goes where that's the point of like, how do you run assertions on data at the point of ingest? Yeah. And then the second step, I mean, the contract's great, but what happens when it gets violated? I think that's the part we haven't gotten to, or what are the steps we want to take when this assertion about this data structure is violated. And that's the operational part that I don't know that we've quite answered, or I think I've seen a solution that really gets to that.
Yeah. And Eric, another topic of interest to a lot of data teams is product experimentation. I wonder if you could give a couple of kind of keys that you've seen to making that succeed. I know you've led experimentation teams before.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is really important is actually having analytics have a seat at the table right with product right at the beginning. I think one of the things that I've seen quite a bit that causes some issues here is when product and maybe data engineering are talking about a change that they want to make or push, and it's implemented, and then analytics sees it and says, well, we can't really tell you much about how this did, because we didn't really align on what was important, what were you trying to learn, what are the KPIs, what are the data events that need to be created and tracked and QA'd in order to actually tell you anything about it. And then it's a shame because you don't really learn anything after you did a whole experiment. So I think one of the things that I've done in the past is actually, as analytics kind of sat in with product right at the beginning and aligned on, all right, what is this change you want to make? What do you want to learn? All those things I just mentioned. Then we go to the data engineering and we say, like, all right, well, based on this, here collectively is our sort of requirements here for this experiment to be run correctly, and then have confidence that as the data comes into analytics, we're able to push it back to product in a way that is useful.
Makes a lot of sense. Okay, I'd just like to thank you both, Brandon and Eric, for your time today. Thanks for joining us, and all the best for 2023.